Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about how artificial intelligence has the potential to significantly enhance the use of medical imaging in healthcare and to provide a balanced view of where the technology is today and what is needed for it to have a widespread impact on patients from the UK and also globally. Today's talk will begin with a history of artificial intelligence and in particular neural networks, which are the tools most commonly applied in medical image analysis. I'll provide a practical overview of how neural networks, in particular deep neural networks, can learn from existing data to provide automated decision-making and decision support. There are a wide range of applications across healthcare, so I'll summarise these before detailing some specific examples in medical imaging that have been developed in the UK and are already being used in routine clinical practice, or at least in large-scale clinical studies. Finally, I'll outline some of the challenges that lie ahead if these techniques are to be able to realise their potential and improve patient care on a daily basis across the whole of the NHS and beyond. So let's start with a practical example that many of you will be familiar with.
The CPU is a neural net processor, a learning computer.
For most of us, the term artificial intelligence conjures up a dystopian view of the near future, where humans have abdicated key decision-making to computers, which are now working against us. For this reason, I think it's important to start by separating out some of the terminology which is commonly used. Precise definitions may vary, but artificial intelligence refers to the ability whereby computers can mimic cognitive functions normally associated with the human mind, such as learning and problem-solving. Machine learning describes the algorithms and statistical approaches that computers can use to perform a specific task without it being explicitly programmed. Therefore, the programmer is not obliged to know the precise formula in advance. As we shall see later on, this is particularly relevant when labelling medical images according to diagnosis, based on subtle and sometimes visually imperceptible patterns in the images themselves. Deep learning is a term that you may have heard over the last few years. In fact, earlier this month, 3 of the most famous researchers in this field were awarded the Turing Prize, often referred to as the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. Deep learning is a specific form of machine learning, which is particularly suited to handling large input data like images, where not only are there many, many pixels to consider, but an even larger number of possible interactions between those pixels, which may represent textures or structural features associated with a patient. Deep learning is an extension of frameworks called artificial neural networks, which are loosely inspired by how the brain learns to recognize objects and patterns from examples. Artificial neural networks have been around for a long time, even longer than the Terminator, since 1943 in fact, when these 2 Chicago researchers, McCulloch and Pitts, suggested that the brain could be simulated by networks of artificial neurons capable of transmitting signals to each other. In this model, an artificial neuron can take a number of input signals, for example the intensity of pixels in an image, each multiplied by an individual weighting function, which are then added together. The neuron fires if this sum of these weighted inputs exceeds a certain threshold, which is known as the activation function. The idea here is that if the weights have been set correctly, the neuron can label new input data as either matching or not matching the example it was trained to fire for. Of course, in an image, there are typically a large number of input pixels and possible interactions between them. So by adding multiple layers of artificial neurons together, it is possible to learn increasingly complex relationships between the input data and the output decision or label. Other than the input and output layers, these intermediate layers are usually called hidden layers. The trick is to set the weights correctly, which is done by training a network with examples of input data where the output label is already known. From arbitrary starting weights, the error between the calculated label and its true value is fed back through the network, and the values of the weights are adjusted until the output labels calculated by the network match the labels that are already known for these examples. In this example, we can see a network being used to learn the relationship between the 2D location of a pixel in the image and its colour. So far, we've talked about inputs as pixels, but images contain a lot more information, for example patterns, textures and shapes. Convolutional filters are a versatile tool for extracting this kind of information, and indeed the term convolutional neural network is used a lot in the literature. Here we can see some examples of how convolutional filters can extract information from images. From the original image we have a smoothing filter so that we can see larger features, an edge filter, and an averaging or max pool filter. Where convolutional filters really come into their own is in applying deep learning to images. This famous example of handwriting recognition shows how many different convolutions are generated from the input image, and the deep neural network is then trained to work out for itself which of these convolutions contain information which influences the output label. Unsupervised means that you aren't telling the network where the interesting parts of the image are in advance, and allows us to tackle a much wider range of problems where we haven't already discovered a model or an algorithm. So why, if artificial neural networks have been in existence since the 1940s, are they so in vogue today? Well, in part we can thank teenagers. One of the challenges in training deep neural networks is that they require vast amounts of computing power. The advent of graphics processing units, originally produced to allow PCs to render high-resolution video games, have allowed us to train complex models on a routine basis in a relatively short amount of time. The other key driver is the availability of the vast datasets of examples required for training, partly delivered via the cloud. Outside of the medical domain, deep learning is already associated with classifying images, for example, think of Google image search, for learning complex games and being able to defeat human champions, whether at Go or at Space Invaders, and for enabling autonomous transport by allowing guidance systems to learn complex and varying environments and make navigational decisions accordingly. More significantly, we are now able to solve a conundrum which has puzzled humanity for decades, if not centuries: Chihuahua or muffin? So given deep learning's potential to enable accurate decision-making based on complex input data, let's consider some of the general areas within healthcare where it is believed to be able to make an impact. By replicating some previously expert tasks, it may be able to mitigate the increasing burden on the healthcare system, most likely by prioritizing patients who do require the immediate attention of a trained human clinician, for example in a screening setting. By learning from examples generated by senior clinicians, it can help achieve consistency across different healthcare settings, where local or junior clinicians may be less experienced or more poorly resourced. As these techniques can consider a much larger set of inputs than the human eye, which caps out at 3 dimensions, deep learning suggests new diagnostics, which work by analysing multiple images simultaneously, for example CT and MRI. If trained on input examples where the eventual clinical outcome is known, machine learning may provide predictive diagnostics. Overall, machine learning is now recognised as having the potential to mitigate the ever-growing data analysis responsibilities of the clinician, moving these repeatable tasks to an algorithm and allowing the clinician to focus directly on the patient in a one-to-one setting. And here you can see a range of clinical applications, from preclinical drug development to surgery, from the patient's wrist or smartphone to the pathology lab, and from mental health interventions to system-wide operational efficiency savings. To underline the accelerating level of activity in this area, I think these infographics tell an interesting story. On the left, you have 106 startups globally in 2017 who are applying artificial intelligence in healthcare, while on the right, you have the results of a market report commissioned by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on AI in late 2018, which identified 100 companies in the UK alone, and this number continues to rise. So what are some of these companies doing? Murata Medical is using deep learning to contour images used to plan radiotherapy treatment. The task of manually delineating areas of the patient or contouring which are to be spared during treatment is time-consuming and subjective. Their FDA-approved DLC Expert tool learns contours from the leading clinicians in a hospital, which can then be automatically applied to new patients, regardless of the operator. Chiron Medical's MIA software is CE marked and currently undergoing large-scale clinical studies. Here, the challenge is, as in other branches of radiology, to deal with the volume of images that need to be analysed as part of national breast cancer screening programmes. Typically, screening mammograms are read by 2 independent radiologists, a requirement that is becoming harder to meet given a national and international shortage of qualified readers, set against a 30% year-on-year increase in data capture. This software replaces one of the reads, working in tandem with a single human expert. The clinical team at Moorfields Eye Hospital have collaborated with scientists at DeepMind to develop a tool which can analyse retinal scans in 30 seconds to generate an urgency score and detailed diagnosis, allowing the most severely affected patients to be seen first. Pending regulatory approval, Results published in Nature last year showed the system is capable of detecting a range of eye diseases with the same level of accuracy as the world's leading specialists. Ultromics have developed ECG analysis technology, which aims to reduce diagnostic errors by over 75%, leading to significantly more accurate diagnoses of coronary artery disease. Based on one of the most widely used diagnostic tests, this system is now being trialled in over 20 NHS trusts and in the US, with product launch planned for this year. Another area of medical imaging which has been positively impacted by these techniques is pathology, where the standard of care is still manual interpretation of digitised slides of tissue samples. Major hospitals in the UK and other parts of the world are starting to make significant investments into digital pathology, preparing for the transfer of these algorithms into the clinic. Advancements in medical imaging, computer vision and machine learning have enabled opportunities to support pathologists with new tools and to improve the quality of clinical reporting. Tissue imaging provides new opportunities to link information on tissue architecture with molecular markers or gene expression. This will provide new diagnostic services and integrate various different measurements, including those obtained from some of the well-known imaging modalities that have already been discussed today. For all this potential, there are good reasons why this technology is not already widely deployed within the NHS and other healthcare providers. Some of the barriers and pitfalls include real examples, such as identifying opportunities in the workflow where this will simplify rather than complicate the clinical pathway. Labeling of training data. What happens if your algorithm learns from bad human diagnoses? And in particular, computer scientists alone cannot develop these algorithms. Clinicians need to be involved from the beginning to interpret and label the training data. Bias in models. Has your dermatology application only been trained on Caucasian patients? Performance on a wider population. Does your lung cancer screening algorithm, trained on data from a single scanner, provide incorrect diagnoses when presented with new data from a different model of scanner? Ensuring that do no harm is applied both in development but also when these tools are deployed. We must guard against the situation where care providers completely forfeit decision-making to the algorithm. Also, how do we ensure that these techniques fulfill their promise to ensure global care quality rather than serve only to widen the gap in healthcare provision between the first and the third world? Being able to rationalise the diagnoses produced by these systems is important for clinical accountability, but can be challenging given that their use is motivated by the precise fact that the algorithms are not known in advance. Who owns the data? The NHS, patient, or the physician, and is it being handled appropriately, for example in compliance with GDPR and anonymisation? Finally, due to the rapidly evolving state of technology, regulators such as the FDA and MHRA are moving to adapt their guidance to support these new techniques, but that does not give manufacturers the right to ignore the regulations that exist today. Let's wrap up by looking into the near future. The recently published Topol review, which set out to identify the workforce skills needed to deliver a digitally enabled NHS, predicts that by 2030, over 50% of care pathways will be impacted by automated image interpretation using artificial intelligence. To overcome some of the barriers I just outlined, we will need to ensure that we incentivise cross-sector collaboration to deliver the clear benefits of this technology to routine clinical practice, which will involve clinicians, regulators, technologists, and patients. Thank you very much.